The morning it happened, I was running 15 minutes behind. That was nothing unusual. Since the accident, 15 minutes behind had become my version of on time, the extra minutes it took to get the leg brace fitted right, to get down the porch steps without rushing, to do the small negotiations with my own body that I'd learned. Over 2 years of physical therapy and adjustment, and the specific ongoing education of living in a body that no longer did what you expected, were non-negotiable. You couldn't hurry them. You could either accept the 15 minutes or spend your whole day angry about it. And I'd made my peace with that choice about 8 months in. My name is Marcus Hill. I'm 43 years old. I lost partial mobility in my right leg 2 years ago in a car accident on Route 9 that was not my fault, and that I have spent approximately zero energy being bitter about, because bitterness is a tax on your own time, and I have better things to do with mine. I have physical therapy 3 times a week at a clinic 12 minutes from my house. I have a job I do remotely that I'm good at. I have a house in a cul-de-sac that my neighbors helped me modify after I came home from the hospital. They built the ramp themselves. A Saturday in April, 8 people showing up with tools and lumber and bad jokes and cold coffee, and I stood in my doorway watching them work and felt something I still don't have the right word for. I have a handicap placard displayed in my windshield that I am legally entitled to, and that represents, among other things, the ability to get to the appointments that keep me functional. I have a dash cam that runs continuously from the moment I start the car. And I have a second camera mounted inside my garage, pointed at the driveway, that I installed 6 weeks after Karen became HOA president, because something about the way she looked at my car in my assigned disabled space told me, without her saying a word, that she was going to be a problem. Karen had been president for 4 months when my car was towed. In those 4 months, she had sent me 3 formal notices. The first was about the ramp, the one my neighbors built. The one I need. The one that is federally protected under the ADA, has a reasonable modification to my property. The notice called it an unapproved structural alteration and requested its removal within 30 days. I sent back a 2-paragraph letter with the relevant federal statute cited and told her the ramp stays. The second notice was about my trash bin being 6 inches outside the approved placement zone, which I'm not making up. The third was a general warning about maintaining community standards, which was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough, in context, to mean me. I want to be clear about what I understood Karen to be doing, because I don't think she was confused about the rules or overzealous about enforcement in some well-meaning way that went too far. I think she looked at my house and saw something she didn't want in her neighborhood. The ramp on the front porch, the cane by the door, the handicap placard in the windshield of a car that took a little longer than the other cars to pull in and out of its space. I think she made a calculation about what kind of neighbor she wanted to have, and I didn't fit the picture, and I think she used the clipboard and the bylaws and the formal notices as the mechanism for expressing something she couldn't say directly without it being exactly what it was. I think that because of what she said on the recording. But I'm getting to that. The registration sticker was delayed. This is mundane and documented. I'd renewed online 3 weeks earlier, paid the fee, received the confirmation email with a tracking number. The physical sticker was in transit. Vermont DMV was backed up, as Vermont DMV occasionally is, and the sticker hadn't arrived yet. The registration was current. The renewal was confirmed. If you called the DMV and gave them my plate number, they would tell you in 45 seconds that the registration was valid. This is not a complicated situation. This is a thing that happens to people all the time, and that any reasonable enforcement of any reasonable rule would handle with a notice and a 2-week window to produce documentation. Karen did not call the DMV. At 7:42 in the morning on a Tuesday, the tow truck rolled into the cul-de-sac. I was on my porch. I'd come out to get the mail, and I stood there with my cane and watched the truck come around the curve, and I felt, in the specific way you feel things when they've been building for a while and you've been watching them come, a cold settling in my chest that wasn't quite surprise. Karen was already there. Navy blazer, pearls, clipboard, the full presentation. She was standing with her arms folded and her chin at the particular angle she used when she wanted you to understand that she had already decided how this was going to go. I told her I'd renewed the registration. I told her the sticker was in the mail. I told her I could show her the confirmation email on my phone right then, standing there on the porch in under a minute. She smiled. "Not my problem," she said. Violation 8, 3C. The tow truck driver was a heavyset man named, I learned later, Roy. Roy looked at my car. He looked at the handicap placard visible through the windshield. He looked at my cane. He looked at Karen. Something moved across his face that I recognized as a person performing the calculation of what his job requires versus what his conscience is telling him, and I watched the calculation happen, and I watched Karen lean in and say something to him in a voice she'd dropped low. I couldn't hear the words from the porch. The cameras could. Roy shifted his weight. He looked at the placard again, and then he went to work. The chains took about 60 seconds. The hydraulics were loud in the quiet of the morning, that mechanical grinding sound that carries, and I was aware of the neighbors, the curtains moving, the faces at windows, the specific non-intervention of people who are watching something they know is wrong and who have not yet found the mechanism to stop it. Humiliation has a sound. It's the hydraulics of a tow truck at 7:42 in the morning while your neighbors watch through glass and say nothing, and the woman with the clipboard watches you watch your car leave and smiles. Karen turned to the street, raised her voice enough to make sure the curtains could hear. Maybe this will teach people to follow community standards. I stood on my porch and I watched my car go. Then I went inside and I made coffee. And I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I pulled up the garage camera footage from that morning and I started watching from the beginning. The dash cam footage came off the car later, after Roy and I want to say something about Roy, which is that he called me that afternoon, unprompted, and apologized and agreed to provide a written statement. Because Roy turned out to be a person with a conscience who had been put in a position that his conscience didn't like, and who, once the weight of Karen's authority was no longer physically present, found it easier to do the right thing. I don't blame Roy for what he did that morning. I understand the position he was in. What I credit him for is what he did after. But the garage camera had the conversation. I watched it frame by frame. Karen stepping close to Roy, dropping her voice to the register she used when she wanted to say something she didn't want attributed to her later. She's behind on dues. If we make this painful, she'll either fall in line or leave. I paused the footage. I sat with that for a moment. I was not behind on dues. I have never been behind on dues. I have 12 months of bank statements showing the exact same payment on the same date each month, cleared and confirmed. Karen had access to the HOA financial records. She knew I was current, which meant she had said something she knew was false to a tow truck driver to provide cover for an action she had already decided to take for reasons that had nothing to do with dues or registration or violation 83C. I let the footage run. Roy's voice uncomfortable, gesturing toward the windshield, but the placard Karen's voice flat and final, I don't care, hook it. Then, a few seconds later, Karen glancing toward the house. Her voice with something in it that wasn't enforcement language, wasn't clipboard language, wasn't the practiced cadence of a president managing community standards. It was something older and uglier and more personal than any of that. Maybe he shouldn't have moved into a neighborhood he can't maintain. I stopped the playback. I sat at my kitchen table in the silence of my house, and I thought about the Saturday in April when 8 of my neighbors showed up with lumber and tools and bad jokes and built me a ramp. I thought about Tom from across the street who had measured the grade 3 times to make sure it was right. I thought about Diane 2 doors down who had brought lunch for everyone and stayed until the last board was screwed down. I thought about what this neighborhood had been to me since the accident, what it had meant to come home to people who showed up. And I thought about Karen looking at my house and deciding I was something to be removed. The footage was backed up in 3 places by 3 in the afternoon. Cloud storage, an external drive, and a USB that I put in the fireproof box in my office closet alongside my insurance documents and my deed. I am a methodical person. I was a methodical person before the accident, and the accident made me more so. Because when your body becomes something you have to manage carefully, you develop habits of documentation that extend to everything else. At 5 in the evening, I emailed a copy of the footage, unedited with timestamps and a brief cover note, to Daniel Reeves. Daniel was an attorney I knew from the neighborhood association meetings, not the HOA meetings, a separate community organization that predated Karen's regime, and that she had tried unsuccessfully to absorb into her governance structure. He practiced civil rights law. He had been publicly mocked by Karen at the last board meeting when he raised questions about the ADA compliance of a proposed new community rule, and he had received the mockery with the specific patience of a person who was filing it away rather than responding to it. When I reached out, I said only that I had footage of something that had happened that morning and that I thought he should see it before I decided what to do next. He called me back in 20 minutes. He had watched the footage twice. His voice was calm and even, the voice of a person who has seen things professionally that have calibrated his response to outrage. But I could hear underneath it a particular quality that I recognized as controlled anger. He said, "Marcus, are you available tomorrow morning?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Don't talk to Karen. Don't post anything publicly yet. Let me make some calls tonight." I said, "Okay." I made dinner. I watched something on television that I don't remember. I went to bed and lay in the dark for a while thinking about Karen's voice on the recording, the specific flatness of "I don't care," the way she said "hook it" the way you say something that has already been decided, and then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it at midnight wasn't going to get my car back or change what she'd said, and I needed to sleep because I had physical therapy in the morning and my ride was already arranged. By the following evening, every HOA board member had received the footage. Daniel had sent it with a cover letter that was precise and formal and, I was told by two board members afterward, deeply alarming to read. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 6:30 that evening at the clubhouse. I got there early. Daniel was already seated, legal pad open, pen uncapped, the organized stillness of a person who has prepared thoroughly and is not in a hurry. I sat next to him with my cane across my lap. Neighbors filed in, the board members took their seats with the careful body language of people who have seen the footage and are arranging themselves around what it means. The room had a specific quality, not loud, not agitated, just cold in the way that rooms get cold when everyone present knows something serious is about to happen and nobody is pretending otherwise. Karen arrived 8 minutes before the meeting started. She was in full presentation mode, pearls, blazer, the binder she carried to meetings, this one labeled enforcement actions in her neat block lettering. She walked to the front of the room with her chin at the angle she used, and she looked around at the assembled neighbors and board members, and she misread the room completely. Later, thinking about it, I understood why. She had walked into rooms like this for months and found them manageable. She had walked in with her binder and her authority and her practiced certainty that she controlled the frame. And the frame had held. She had no reason, from her own experience, to expect it not to hold tonight. Daniel stood when the meeting was called to order. He introduced himself formally for the record name, bar number, the civil rights practice. He stated clearly that Marcus Hill's HOA dues were fully paid and current, producing bank statements. He stated that the registration renewal had been completed 3 weeks prior and that the confirmation was documented. He stated that the handicap placard displayed in the vehicle was valid and legally protected under federal law. He stated that the disabled parking space was an assigned space under the terms of Marcus Hill's HOA agreement. Then the screen at the front of the room came on. Karen's voice came through the clubhouse speakers in the specific way that a voice sounds when it has been recorded without its owner's awareness of being recorded, unmodulated, unguarded, exactly itself. She's behind on dues. If we make this painful. The room shifted, not with noise, with the specific physical language of people receiving information that changes their understanding of what they've been living inside. The second clip. I don't care. Hook it. The third. Maybe he shouldn't have moved into a neighborhood he can't maintain. A board member 2 seats from Karen looked at the table. Another looked at the wall. Nobody looked at Karen. Daniel placed the demand letter in front of her. He didn't slide it dramatically. He just put it on the table in front of her the way you put a document in front of someone when you want them to read it. Civil claim for damages, emotional distress, wrongful towing, ADA-related discrimination. Karen named individually, not just the HOA, because the conduct captured on the recording was personal conduct, directive, and deliberate, not institutional policy. Karen's hand reached for the letter, and I watched it tremble. Just slightly. Just enough to see. Then Roy walked in. He had called Daniel that morning. I learned later without being asked. He had prepared the statement himself, had it notarized at a UPS store on his lunch break, and had driven to the meeting to deliver it in person because he told Daniel he wanted to look at the board when he handed it over. He didn't look at Karen. He walked to the board table and placed the statement in front of the board president, and then took a seat in the back row. The statement said, I was instructed to proceed despite clearly visible disability credentials. I expressed concern. I was told to hook it anyway. Karen's chair scraped against the floor. This is ridiculous, she said. I was enforcing policy. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Policy, he said evenly, doesn't instruct tow truck drivers to ignore federal disability credentials. Policy doesn't fabricate dues delinquency as cover for a personal grievance. Policy doesn't make statements about whether a disabled neighbor belongs in a community. He paused. Everything you said on that recording was said by you, in your capacity as HOA president, about a specific resident on the record. It is not taken out of context. It is the context. He placed one more document on the table, notice of intent to file with the State Civil Rights Division. The board president cleared his throat. He was a man named Gerald who had been, by most accounts, a fairly neutral presence in Karen's administration, neither a collaborator nor an objector, someone who had let things happen by not stopping them. I think Gerald had been doing the calculation that a lot of people do in these situations, which is that the cost of direct confrontation exceeds the cost of looking away right up until the moment the cost of looking away becomes catastrophic, and then the calculation changes. He looked at the demand letter. He looked at Roy's notarized statement. He looked at Karen. He said in the flattest possible voice, effective immediately, "Karen is suspended from all HOA duties pending a full investigation by the board." The word suspended landed in the room with a weight that was disproportionate to its syllables. I watched Karen receive it. Watched the thing underneath the blazer and the pearls and the binder full of enforcement actions, the certainty, the absolute bedrock conviction that she understood the operating rules of this world and that the operating rules protected her. I watched that thing crack. Not collapse. Crack. There's a difference. Collapse is dramatic. A crack is quiet and structural and permanent. She gathered her binder. She stood. She said nothing else. She walked out of the clubhouse and the door closed behind her, and the room held its silence for a moment, and then Gerald said, "We have other business to address," and the meeting continued. My car was returned the following day, towing fees waived, a formal written apology from the towing company that I suspect was drafted by their legal department. Karen resigned from the HOA presidency 8 days after the meeting, before the investigation formally concluded, which told me something about what the investigation was finding. The civil claim was filed and settled within 6 weeks. I'm not going to give the number. What I will say is that it was meaningful, and that it was accompanied by a formal written acknowledgement of the ADA violations, which mattered to me more than the number. You can look up what the ADA says about reasonable modifications and accessible parking and the rights of disabled residents in common interest communities. It says them clearly. It doesn't hedge. The neighborhood voted the month after to amend the HOA enforcement procedures, transparency clauses, oversight requirements. No enforcement action above a written warning could be taken without recorded board approval. 2 board members who had been present for the worst of Karen's tenure resigned and were replaced by people who seemed to understand that community governance was a service, not an authority structure. Tom came over on the Saturday after Karen resigned. He didn't make it a thing, just knocked. Said he was going to the hardware store, asked if I needed anything. I said I was good. He stood on the porch for a moment, and then he said, "For what it's worth, I should have said something sooner." I told him I understood why he hadn't. He nodded. We stood there for a minute. He went to the hardware store. That was the conversation, and it was enough. My physical therapy continues. 3 times a week, 12 minutes from the house, the same route I've been driving for 2 years. The therapist's name is Janet, and she has the specific combination of encouragement and honesty that makes a good physical therapist, and we have made, together, more progress than the initial prognosis suggested was probable. My right leg is not what it was before the accident, and it may never be. That's a sentence I have made my peace with. What I have is functional and improving and mine, and I get myself to the appointments, and I get myself home. And the placard in my windshield is current and valid and displayed in the windshield of a car that sits in my assigned space in front of a house with a ramp that my neighbors built on a Saturday in April. The ramp is solid. Tom measured the grade 3 times. On a Tuesday morning about a month after the settlement, I was on my porch with coffee, earlier than I needed to be, just sitting. The cul-de-sac was quiet, the way it's quiet before the day starts, no cars moving, no voices, just the sound of the neighborhood at rest. The light was doing what October light does in the morning, coming in low and sideways through the trees, making ordinary things look considered. I watched a squirrel make a decision about something in the middle of the street and then change its mind. I drank my coffee. I thought about nothing in particular. The cameras were running. They're always running now. Old habit. Good habit. A neighbor I didn't know well. A woman named Patricia who lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac and who I had exchanged maybe 6 words with in 2 years, came out of her house and walked to her car and saw me on the porch and raised her hand. Not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. I raised mine back. She got in her car and drove away, and the street was quiet again, and the coffee was getting cold, and the light was still doing its October thing through the trees. I stayed on the porch a little longer. Some mornings that's all there is, and some mornings that's everything.